In the shadow of yesterday's extraordinary arrest of the man now simply known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on suspicion of misconduct in public office, royal biographer Tom Bower has issued a prediction so stark that it has sent ripples of quiet alarm through both palace corridors and the sunlit hills of Montecito alike. When Prince William finally becomes king, it will be a matter of when, not if, he moves decisively to strip Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of their royal titles, an act that would complete the slow unraveling of the status they have clung to so tenaciously while building what many quietly describe as a rather strained Hollywood reinvention. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this development, for beneath the surface of today's headlines lies a story of calculated fear, institutional pressure, and consequences that could reshape not only one family, but the very idea of what royalty means in our modern age. Tom Bower, whose decades of forensic royal reporting have earned him both admiration and the occasional raised eyebrow in certain quarters, spoke with characteristic candor in his latest February interviews, pointing directly to the precedent set by Andrew's swift and merciless fall from grace. It was only last October when King Charles, after years of hesitation, finally initiated the formal process that saw his younger brother stripped of his princely title, his Duke of York dignity, and even evicted from the royal lodge he had called home for 20 years. Now, with fresh police searches and that dramatic arrest unfolding almost in real time, the message from within palace circles could hardly be clearer. A well-placed source close to the institution confides that the monarchy has shown it will act without sentiment when its reputation hangs in the balance, and Harry, watching from across the Atlantic, has been left in no doubt about the new rules of the game. One can only imagine the private conversation that took place in the hushed luxury of their Montecito home in the days immediately following Andrew's title stripping last autumn. According to someone long acquainted with family dynamics, Harry sat with Meghan and spoke in no uncertain terms of the terror that now grips him, the realization that once his brother wears the crown, the same unforgiving logic could be applied to them both, and to the children whose princely and princessly styles suddenly feel far more fragile than anyone in California had allowed themselves to believe. There was, one senses, a moment of raw vulnerability beneath the polished exteriors they present to the world, Harry perhaps pacing the room with that familiar mixture of indignation and dread, while Meghan, ever the strategist, would have calculated the financial and reputational cost of losing the very branding that still lends an aura of prestige to their various ventures. The atmosphere in that sun-drenched Californian estate must have felt suddenly claustrophobic, the glossy isolation that once promised freedom now echoing with the distant thunder of London decisions, the pressure mounting as every tabloid and podcast dissected the Andrew precedent and wondered aloud how long the Sussex titles could possibly survive. For Harry, the long-term consequences of such a move are almost too painful to contemplate. The man who once walked away from royal duty in search of privacy and purpose would find himself not liberated, but diminished, his children's future standing in the line of succession potentially reviewed, their inherited mystique evaporated, leaving the family reliant solely on whatever commercial success they can muster in a market that has grown noticeably cooler toward their particular brand of celebrity. A source behind closed doors whispers that this fear has driven Harry to explore quiet overtures back toward the United Kingdom while his father still reigns, an almost desperate attempt to shore up what remains of his position before the inevitable transition. Yet one cannot help but feel a touch of cynicism at the notion that after years of very public recriminations, such gestures could be met with anything warmer than polite formality. Prince William, by contrast, is portrayed by those who know him best as a man of quiet steel and strategic patience. He has watched his father navigate controversy with a preference for reconciliation and gradual compromise, yet insiders suggest the future king harbors no such inclination toward prolonged tolerance of what he sees as ongoing reputational risk. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, recovering with characteristic grace from her own health challenges, is understood to share this protective instinct for the institution she will one day help lead, and together they represent a generational shift toward a leaner, more disciplined monarchy that simply cannot afford the sort of endless public drama that has accompanied the Sussexes' departure. One pictures William in the private moments at Kensington Palace, weighing the heavy responsibility of preserving something ancient and fragile for his own three children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and deciding that nostalgia must never trump necessity. The atmosphere within those historic walls is said to be one of focused resolve rather than vengeful haste. Yet the message is unmistakable that when the moment comes, there will be no drawn-out negotiations, only clear, constitutional action. The broader consequences stretch far beyond one couple's titles, of course. Should William choose to follow the Andrew template, the monarchy would emerge slimmer, perhaps more credible in the eyes of a skeptical public weary of expensive royal outliers living abroad while still trading on their royal connections. Yet the human cost would be profound. Harry and Meghan's carefully constructed narrative of independence suddenly exposed as dependent on the very institution they once criticized so freely. A longtime family acquaintance reflects that the Sussexes have always underestimated the quiet power of precedent, believing their transatlantic distance and celebrity alliances would insulate them forever. But recent months have shown how swiftly the ground can shift, how even the most gilded California lifestyle can feel precarious when the source of its lingering prestige is placed under formal review. And so we watch, with the detached fascination of those who understand that great institutions rarely forgive those who appear to profit from their discomfort, as the pieces of this particular royal puzzle continue to fall into place with an almost inexorable logic. Yet the most telling cracks are appearing not in the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, but in the very products and parties the Sussexes hoped would replace the crown they left behind. And it is there, in the increasingly awkward glare of public scrutiny, that the true fragility of their position becomes impossible to ignore. Yet even as the distant prospect of a title review looms like a gathering storm over Montecito, the immediate tremors are being felt most acutely in the glossy but increasingly strained world of Meghan Markle's lifestyle enterprise, a venture rebranded with what insiders quietly describe as hurried optimism from American Riviera orchard to the rather more enigmatic as ever after. Trademark complications forced a swift pivot that many observers viewed as emblematic of a broader pattern of reinvention, without quite the solid foundation one might expect from such an ambitious Duchess-turned-entrepreneur. One can picture the private moments in that sunlit Californian compound, where Meghan, ever the meticulous curator of her own narrative, must have sat reviewing sales figures and customer feedback with a mixture of defiant resolve and mounting exasperation, inwardly questioning how the public could fail to embrace the carefully crafted vision of artisanal spreads, floral sprinkles, and signature candles that were meant to signal independence and sophistication rather than reliance on faded royal echoes. The atmosphere around her team, according to a longtime family acquaintance, has grown thick with the quiet pressure of unmet expectations, deadlines slipping amid quality hiccups, and the nagging awareness that without the lingering prestige of those Sussex titles, the entire enterprise risks sliding from aspirational luxury into the crowded, unforgiving arena of celebrity-adjacent novelties that rarely endure. A source within the inner circle confides that the rebrand itself carried an undercurrent of quiet desperation, an attempt to shed geographical limitations and expand horizons, yet it only seemed to highlight the fragility when early 2026 website glitches briefly exposed vast inventories, hundreds of thousands of jars of jam, candles, and bottles of wine, prompting online whispers of sluggish sales despite the brand's insistence that the stock reflected bold plans for international growth rather than overproduction born of optimism outpacing demand. The pricing controversies that erupted around the Valentine's collections only amplified that sense of unease, with bundles pairing a $12 fruit spread and $14 chocolate bar suddenly listed at $29 for the duo, a $3 premium that struck many as the very opposite of the thoughtful value one associates with premium gifting, and instead invited cynical commentary about markups dressed up as exclusivity. Meghan herself, one senses, would have felt the sting of such criticism deeply, pacing perhaps through her kitchen or study while calculating the fine line between positioning her products as elevated lifestyle essentials and alienating the very audience she hoped would sustain the brand long after royal connections faded. The surrounding atmosphere charged with the low hum of social media scrutiny and internal debates over whether to discount or double down on perceived sophistication. Long-term, the consequences stretch beyond a disappointing quarter, painting a portrait of a commercial identity that, without the scaffolding of ducal titles to lend it an aura of unassailable elegance, may gradually erode into something more ordinary. A former actress's passion project struggling against established players in a luxury market notoriously ruthless toward those whose celebrity cachet proves more fleeting than anticipated, leaving the Sussexes' carefully curated Montecito existence ever more dependent on maintaining at least the illusion of royal adjacency. A well-meaning staff member, speaking on condition of anonymity, has hinted at the mounting returns and quiet clearances, with reports of storage rooms at Netflix's Los Angeles headquarters overflowing to the point where employees were reportedly invited to help themselves to armfuls of unsold jams, candles, and sprinkles, 10 items at a time in some cases, as promotional samples that many quietly viewed as evidence of overstock rather than generous gifting, an atmosphere of subdued embarrassment hanging over what was once touted as a sold-out sensation. Yet for all the polished Instagram presentations and carefully worded newsletters framing these as growing pains of an independent venture, the cumulative effect has been to render the retention of royal titles not merely symbolic, but practically essential, a well-placed source within palace-adjacent circles observing that the Sussexes' urgency to maintain their styling has only intensified as business headwinds mount, the long-term vision of a self-sustaining California dynasty suddenly appearing contingent on the very institutional ties they once sought to loosen. One cannot help but note the quiet cynicism in how these missteps, pricing puzzles, wickless disappointments, clearance whispers, have unfolded against the backdrop of Andrew's own fall from grace, each product controversy serving as a microcosm of the larger reputational recalibration underway, where the aura of royalty, once taken for granted, now feels like the last fragile thread holding the narrative together. The atmosphere in Montecito, by all accounts, has shifted from triumphant reinvention to a more guarded vigilance, with Meghan's private frustrations manifesting in tighter control over messaging and Harry's reported overtures toward reconciliation carrying the unspoken subtext of shoring up relevance before the next chapter of monarchy renders such efforts moot. The so-called Photogate affair with the Kardashian circle only deepened that sense of eroding influence, a seemingly minor scheduling mishap that ballooned into a revealing glimpse of mismatched expectations and bruised sensitivities. Reports from those close to the events describe how photographs from a private baby-to-baby charity gathering briefly surfaced online, capturing Harry and Meghan in relaxed dancing moments at what was ostensibly a low-key celebration tied to Kris Jenner's milestone birthday. The images were swiftly deleted, ostensibly out of respect for Remembrance Day observances, yet according to a well-placed source within inner circles, the deletion followed a rather tense exchange in which Meghan, rather than offering the graceful apology one might expect, reportedly placed a panicked yet characteristically assured call to Kris Jenner, framing the situation as sensitive and complex. One pictures the scene in that sun-drenched California setting, Meghan pacing with the calculated poise of someone who has long mastered the art of narrative control, inwardly seething at what she perceived as a casual dismissal of optics by those who no longer automatically defer to her royal-adjacent status, while the surrounding atmosphere crackled with the low hum of Hollywood's unspoken hierarchies suddenly asserting themselves. Kim Kardashian, by contrast, is said to have viewed it simply as an unfortunate timing oversight rather than a profound cultural faux pas, a perspective that only highlighted the growing disconnect between the Sussexes' lingering sense of entitlement to special handling and the pragmatic realities of today's celebrity ecosystem. The long-term consequences ripple far beyond deleted Instagram posts. This episode underscores how the once automatic assumption of influence, the quiet expectation that others would fall into line to protect their image, is no longer guaranteed, accelerating the slide from sought-after royal exiles to just another couple navigating the fickle tides of fame without the institutional ballast that once elevated every misstep into a matter of international concern. Nowhere has this cooling of the cultural climate been more starkly illustrated than in the increasingly fraught arena of online fandom, where the very supporters who once formed a formidable defensive phalanx have begun to reveal the uncomfortable contradictions at the heart of the Sussex brand. Podcaster Dana Bowling found herself at the center of an unexpected storm when she shared her experience of receiving one of Meghan's much-touted signature candles, only to discover it had arrived without a wick, a seemingly trivial defect that she mentioned in passing during a lighthearted review. What followed was a wave of aggressive backlash from certain quarters of the Sussex online community, the kind of coordinated intensity that prompted Bowling to describe those particular fan groups as among the most hostile she had encountered, surpassing even the most fervent Taylor Swift or political devotees in their readiness to attack perceived critics. One can imagine Meghan's private reaction, a mixture of outward dismissal and inward calculation, perhaps confiding to Harry that such loyalty, while flattering, risks undermining the very messages of kindness and mental wellness they have so publicly championed. The atmosphere in their carefully curated digital echo chamber must feel increasingly strained, the pressure mounting as outsiders note the glaring silence from the couple themselves on the more extreme manifestations of supporter behavior. A longtime family acquaintance reflects that this reluctance to address the toxicity directly, to issue the kind of unequivocal condemnation that might genuinely align with their advocacy, only fuels the perception of selective blindness, and the long-term consequences are already emerging in the form of a broader cultural skepticism that views the Sussexes' brand of victimhood and virtue signaling with a more jaundiced eye. What was once a powerful asset, the mobilized army of online defenders, now risks becoming a liability, chipping away at credibility and making genuine rehabilitation in the eyes of the wider public that much harder to achieve. These celebrity fractures and fan dynamics together paint a portrait of a carefully constructed world beginning to fray at the edges, where the easy sympathy that greeted the couple's departure from royal life has given way to a more measured, occasionally outright dismissive appraisal. Harry, one suspects, carries the heavier emotional burden here. The man who once spoke so passionately about mental health now confronted daily with the irony of his own supporters' conduct and the quiet withdrawal of high-profile voices he might once have counted as allies. Meghan, ever the architect of image, must navigate the delicate balance between projecting unshakable confidence and acknowledging the subtle erosion of the cultural capital they traded upon. The atmosphere across their California existence has shifted from one of triumphant reinvention to a more watchful vigilance, the pressure of maintaining relevance in an unforgiving marketplace and media landscape manifesting in tighter messaging, selective appearances, and that underlying urgency to preserve whatever royal styling remains as a final bulwark against complete normalization. For the long term, these developments suggest a gradual but inexorable marginalization. The couple's narrative of empowerment increasingly reframed by observers as one of entitlement unmet by results. Their Hollywood chapter revealing itself as less a bold new chapter than a poignant illustration of how difficult it is to sustain borrowed prestige without the original source. All of which brings us to the one man whose temperament may finally draw the line under this protracted chapter, the future sovereign whose quiet discipline and institutional focus stand in such marked contrast to the hesitations of the past. Prince William, one senses, has long carried within him a profound inner resolve, a private monologue shaped by years of observing the cost of unresolved tensions, the weight of preserving something sacred for his own children, and the clear-eyed recognition that nostalgia cannot forever shield an ancient institution from the demands of public trust. In the corridors of Kensington Palace, the atmosphere is said to be one of focused, almost monastic calm, where decisions are weighed not in haste, but with the unyielding logic of a man who understands that clarity, once achieved, must be maintained without apology. A well-placed source close to palace circles confides that William has watched the Andrew precedent unfold with something approaching quiet vindication, especially now, in the immediate aftermath of yesterday's arrest of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on suspicion of misconduct in public office, an event that has only reinforced the template of decisive action when reputational risk becomes untenable. One pictures William in those private moments, perhaps walking the grounds with Catherine, the Princess of Wales, still radiating quiet strength in her recovery, discussing not revenge but necessity, the long-term consequence being a monarchy stripped of its more burdensome appendages, leaner, more credible, and far better equipped to endure in an age that has grown impatient with inherited privilege untethered from service. Tom Bauer, whose February 12th reflections have once again ignited the conversation, has been unequivocal in his assessment that William will not dither as his father sometimes has. The biographer points to the constitutional tools already at hand: letters patent, parliamentary pathways, the simple redefinition of who may style themselves as working royalty, and suggests that once the crown passes, the review of non-working titles will be framed not as personal reckoning, but as essential housekeeping for a streamlined institution. Harry, according to those who have observed him closely, must feel the tightening of that timeline acutely. His reported openness to some form of return or reconciliation, now carrying the unmistakable air of a man racing against the clock, inwardly calculating whether the Invictus Games or a carefully timed visit might yet soften the ground before his brother's accession, renders such gestures academic. The atmosphere in Montecito, one imagines, has taken on a new layer of subdued urgency, the glossy Californian idols suddenly shadowed by the knowledge that the titles they have retained as both shield and currency could be reviewed with the same brisk efficiency that saw Andrew stripped of his dignities and evicted from Royal Lodge. A longtime family acquaintance whispers that Harry has spoken privately of his brother's ruthless streak when it comes to protecting the crown, a fear that underscores just how dramatically the power dynamic will shift the moment William ascends. The long-term consequences for the Sussexes would be profound, their children's princely and princessly styles potentially fading into polite obscurity, their commercial ventures deprived of the last vestiges of royal mystique, and the carefully nurtured narrative of dignified independence exposed as dependent on the very institution they once appeared so eager to critique from afar. Yet William, to those who know him, is no vengeful figure driven by sibling grievance. He is, rather, a father of three who has internalized the lessons of his grandmother's reign and his father's patient endurance, a man whose private thoughts likely turn often to the inheritance George, Charlotte, and Louis will one day receive, and whether it will be a robust, respected monarchy or one diluted by endless peripheral drama. Catherine's influence here is quietly pivotal, her own commitment to duty and stability providing a steady counterpoint to any lingering calls for leniency. Together, they embody the generational shift toward a monarchy that prioritizes substance over spectacle, and one can almost feel the quiet pressure building in those historic rooms where the future is quietly mapped out, not with rancor, but with the calm certainty that institutional survival sometimes demands uncomfortable choices. Critics of the Sussexes may cheer such an outcome, while their remaining supporters decry it as punitive, yet even the most balanced observers acknowledge that the collision between centuries-old tradition and modern celebrity imperatives was always likely to produce friction. The Sussex brand, for all its polished presentation, has increasingly come to symbolize the tension between borrowed prestige and earned relevance, and under a William reign, that tension may finally be resolved in favor of the former. Harry's occasional public musings about returning to service, framed by some as conciliatory, are viewed by palace watchers with gentle skepticism, the sort that recognizes the practical impossibility of being half in and half out, as the late Queen so wisely observed, especially when the new sovereign's focus will be on a smaller, tighter royal family unencumbered by distant outliers still trading on old associations. For the monarchy itself, the long-term consequences of such a recalibration could prove transformative, restoring a measure of public confidence eroded by years of very public family discord, reinforcing the notion that titles are not a birthright to be monetized at will, but a privilege tied inextricably to duty and discretion. One senses William's inner monologue in these matters carries the steady refrain of quiet stewardship. This ends with me, a determination to hand on something stronger, less vulnerable to the whims of individual grievance or commercial opportunism. The atmosphere across the royal households in the wake of Andrew's latest legal entanglement feels charged with the recognition that precedents once set are difficult to ignore, and that the public's patience for expensive royal footnotes living abroad while still clinging to styling has its limits. Harry and Meghan, meanwhile, continue their California chapter with the sort of determined reinvention that has always been their hallmark, yet even their most sympathetic chroniclers must admit that the ground beneath them feels less secure than it did 5 years ago. The celebrity alliance is more conditional, the business ventures more exposed to market realities, and the lingering royal titles now carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of borrowed time. The collision of two worlds, ancient tradition and contemporary self-expression, has produced a saga rich in irony and human complexity. And while reconciliation remains theoretically possible, the structural realities of the next reign suggest a cleaner, if more final, delineation. In the end, as this royal chapter continues its slow, inexorable unfolding, one is left reflecting on how fragile even the most gilded of statuses can prove when weighed against the demands of an institution that must, above all, endure. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as this story continues to unfold.